N. Sreekumar is an assistant professor of philosophy in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. He is a gold medalist for MA Philosophy from the Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam. He did his MPhil and PhD in philosophy from the Central University of Hyderabad and specializes in the areas of philosophy of language, continental philosophy, and hermeneutics. He has been into the academic profession since 1995 and has taught in Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, Kerala and BITS Pilani, Rajasthan before joining the IIT Madras in 2003. Dr. Sreekumar has published articles in various journals and has presented papers in national and international seminars. Some of the courses he offers include European Philosophy, Contemporary German Philosophy, Introduction to Indian Philosophy, Philosophical Hermeneutics, Philosophy and Critical Theory, and Philosophy of Language.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series in philosophy on Phenomenology and Existentialism, part 44. With this episode onwards, we will be starting our discussions on existentialism, the philosophy of existentialism, which was a very prominent movement or style of philosophizing that existed in 20th century Europe. So, we will start our discussions with this question: what is existentialism? We will try to explain what existentialism is, what does it mean, and we will see the various directions or various perspectives from which this philosophical movement has been conceived and understood. Then again, different types of existentialism, because this is something which will become clear once we go on analyzing this whole thing called existentialism, that existentialism is not a school of philosophy. So, there are different types of existentialism, we will be seeing that. Then again, some common features of existentialism, though there are different types and different styles of existential philosophy, there are certain common features. We will identify them and discuss them very briefly in this episode. Then we will discuss the key themes of existentialism as part of the common features. We will see some of the very important themes which almost all existential thinkers have highlighted, and then we will see the historical origins of this particular style of philosophizing called existentialism. Now, what is existentialism? As I mentioned, it is not a philosophical school or tradition or system like empiricism and rationalism. We have already examined this, the contributions of these schools of philosophy in Western philosophy, empiricism and rationalism. Though there are various thinkers in the empiricist tradition and rationalist tradition, they all share certain common assumptions. So, in one sense we can say that they all belong to a school of philosophy, a system of philosophy which has got several shared assumptions. But in the case of existentialism, it is not so. So, it is not a school of philosophy, it is not a system. Then here I have a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism is a Humanism. It is a very celebrated, very small book, but a very celebrated book by Jean-Paul Sartre. He says, I quote, "The word existentialism is now so loosely applied to so many things that it no longer means anything at all." Because existentialism during the middle of 20th century or when it was a very prominent movement in Europe, it has attracted intellectuals all over the world. Intellectuals, not just philosophers, but writers, poets, artists. It has attracted the intellectual attention of all these intellectuals. So, naturally people started identifying, people with different perspectives about life started identifying themselves with existentialism. Once we go on analyzing or examining existentialism, the philosophy of existentialism and the philosophers who developed what we call existential philosophy, we will realize that there are different types. I have already mentioned this. So, Sartre sort of complaining that the world is so loosely applied to so many things that it no longer means anything at all. There is no common body of doctrine to which all existentialists subscribe. So, we cannot say that, for example, for the rationalist philosophers, the idea of innate ideas, the notion of innate ideas is a central concept. They all believe in a kind of pre-existing knowledge or the structure of mind, the ability of the mind for conceptualization, which is not the case with existentialists. Now, we will see there are two types of existential philosophies, the theistic and the atheistic. The theistic branch of existentialism is represented by thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard, Martin Buber, Paul Tillich, Gabriel Marcel and Karl Jaspers, which all these thinkers ultimately believe that there is a supreme power, God, that exists, and God has been conceived in different ways, but irrespective of all those differences they all subscribe to the belief that God exists. But when we come to atheistic existentialism, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, then Simone de Beauvoir, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche of course is not an existentialist philosopher in the sense Sartre or Heidegger or even Kierkegaard is an existentialist, but in one sense we can say that Friedrich Nietzsche is a foreigner. He is actually, his philosophy has influenced the whole tradition of existentialism tremendously, and then finally Martin Heidegger. So, all these thinkers do not believe in the existence of a supreme power called God who controls us, who created human beings and all that. And again, since there is no God, since there is no such concept of an external reality, since there is no such concept of a supreme power that creates and controls the universe, values have no meaning. The human value, the so called human values, particularly in the field of ethics and aesthetics, it is values which decide and whether an action is right or wrong, whether a particular action is good or bad, whether a particular feeling is right or not. So, all these things are decided by values, but in a sense if you subscribe to an atheistic perspective, then values lose their meaning, in the sense that values do not have a firm foundation on a concept of God or spiritual reality. And then there is a concept of absurdity. We will see this particularly in the writings of French novelist and philosopher Albert Camus, who has written very successful books like The Myth of Sisyphus, The Rebel and all that, and several novels. So, we could see that there are two basic divisions. There are theistic existentialism and atheistic existentialism, but irrespective of these differences, I have already mentioned, they share certain common assumptions. Now, we will revisit this question, what is existentialism, and I repeat here, it is not a system or school, but a style of philosophizing, and this would communicate what existentialism exactly means. It is not a system of philosophy, as I mentioned earlier. And one very important characteristic feature of existentialism is precisely this, that it begins from man, a philosophy of subject and not of object. So, here it is categorically expresses, existentialism categorically expresses its differences from traditional Western philosophy, which begins with a metaphysical question. So, we can simplify the philosophical approach in the West. The West or the Western philosophers have been trying to understand the reality which is there in front of them. So, it is looking outward, it is looking to the world and trying to understand exactly what the world is, what is it constituted of, whether there is any inner reality than what we normally perceive it, whether there is a reality behind the perceived world. These are some of the fundamental questions of philosophy from time immemorial. For example, Plato conceived that there is a domain of reality which is abstract universal entities. But here, instead of this existential, most of the existential thinkers reject this kind of an approach towards philosophizing and towards reality. For them, the most important questions are concerned with man. So, that is why it begins from man, and it is to the core a philosophy of subject and not a philosophy of object. It is concerned about the object. Object here stands for the world outside the human subject. Definitely it is concerned about the world, but it is concerned about the world because the man, the individual man lives in a world. Since he or she finds himself or herself in a world, he or she is concerned about it. Otherwise, philosophically, the most important problems are the problems of man. So that is why it emphasizes the importance of human existence over everything else. Man as an existent subject and not just as a thinking subject. So there is again a very characteristic deviation from traditional Western philosophy, particularly the kind of Cartesian thought which we have seen in some of our previous episodes. Descartes conceives, or rather the Cartesian philosophy, we have seen it earlier, begins with a kind of doubt, the celebrated Cartesian doubt, which starts doubting everything and finally concludes that the Cartesian philosophy starts with a process of doubting, which doubts everything possible, and finally concludes with the assumption that, or with the firm belief that there is one thing which is beyond all doubt, the fact that I am doubting. So my existence has been derived from the fact that I am thinking, or that rather thoughts exist, and thoughts presupposes a thinker. So thinker exists, and who am I? I am a thinking substance. So my existence is actually derivative, it is not the beginning, rather it is the end of a process. So existentialism takes the other direction, it starts with the assumption that I exist, or rather the most important philosophical question is that of existence, human existence, and everything, all human problems, all philosophy, all theorizing, all intellectual exercise starts with this, the very fact that man exists. So man as an existent subject and not just as a thinking subject. So there is a very big difference between these two kinds of subjects. An existent subject finds himself or herself in a world, and the existing subject has several problems. It is not just a thinking substance, it is not just a thinking subject, but a subject which feels, which has emotions, which has feelings, which does so many other things in the world. So here it is not an intellectual exercise that locates a subject somewhere in the world as a thinking substance, but the whole process of thinking, the whole process of philosophizing starts with the assumption that the subject already exists. A subject who feels, wills, loves, hates and do all kinds of things in the world. It is a concrete human subject. See, once you talk about a subject which is a thinking subject, a thinking substance like the Cartesian subject, Cartesian mind, then the subject is essentially an abstract entity. You cannot see it because it is a thinking substance. It is not a physical entity, only physical entities can be perceived. It is an abstract entity, but here the subject is not an abstract entity like this, but it is a concrete entity, philosophizes not with reason alone. So here normally reason has been identified as the most important vehicle of thought, philosophical thinking. Philosophical thinking employs reasoning. So that is one way in which philosophy traditionally has been conceived as philo plus sophia, love of wisdom, is different from theology or religion. Religion also, or theology also, speculates. It talks about, or it contemplates about realities which we cannot perceive through our sense organs and mind. But here philosophy again, though it speculates, though it employs speculation, its speculations are rational. So philosophizes not with reason alone in the case of existentialism. In this sense they differ from the traditional philosophers. Reason is important, no doubt, but reason alone will not make human thinking. And again it gives primacy to man. So man is at the center, the existing human being, the concrete human being who finds himself or herself in the world is at the center of all philosophical enterprise. So I have been discussing about the primacy given to man, the concrete human being, by the existential thinkers. So here again, as I mentioned earlier, it is not the essence of man, but existence that has been asserted, because when we talk about man, particularly when philosophers talk about man, we are a little confused. Philosophers are not generally bothered about, or traditional philosophy is not generally bothered about, a concrete human being whom you might find in the street or you yourself, but philosophers are concerned with man as a general term, as an abstract entity. So, the essence of man is normally being tackled. Plato is the classic example for that. Even other thinkers, for example Descartes, again when Descartes talks about man, or when Descartes identifies the essence of man, sort of identifying the essence of man in the thinking substance, in the mind, again what is happening is that it is not the particular human being that has been identified and isolated, but he is talking about the general human being. What is, see, the very first sentence in Descartes' celebrated work Discourse and Method starts with the statement that good sense or reason is universally present in all human beings. Since good sense or reason is universally present in all human beings, this is the shareable element. So, all human beings are on par with. So, there is no need of making any distinction between human beings, since there is a universal element which is present in all men. So, this is a kind of Platonic lineage, Platonic legacy. Again when we come to Immanuel Kant, we will find this same. Kant talks about transcendental apperception. He talks about the universal structure of the thinking mind, the 12 categories of understanding. The 12 categories of understanding Kant finds not in an individual man, but in a universal man. Every human being has this. So, it is not the essence of man for the existentialist that is very important, but the existence that is important. And the moment you assert existence, what becomes important is the concrete human being, his or her feelings, his or her emotions, his or her peculiar life and situations. Existence precedes essence. The classical, the most important, the most celebrated statement of existentialism is this: existence precedes essence. Man first exists and makes his own essence. See, here I will be elaborately discussing this in the coming episodes, but I will very briefly explain this here. This is a very important distinction which Sartre makes at the beginning itself, that the difference between an object and human being. An object, for example a pen. A pen is an entity in the world which is made by a person or a company or whatever, and certain purposes are being envisaged with this pen. So, certain human purposes, this pen is expected to meet certain human purposes. So, the essence of the pen is predetermined, but in the case of man there is no such essence, because what a man is, or the essence of a man, is actually not something which is given prior to his existence, but rather it is something which he gains. For example, my essence is something which I make out of my life. If I want to be a painter, I employ that freedom of choice and paints. If I want to be a musician, I can do that. Whatever capacities and abilities and potentialities I have, it is my choice to make use of it and become a person whom I want to be. So, my essence in one sense is created by me. This is only possible in the case of man. Animals cannot do that. Entities like pens and pencils and benches and desks and computers cannot do that. Their essences are fixed, but human essence is never fixed. It is something which needs to be gained, achieved. Life's most important questions are not accessible to reason or science. This is one very important realization, something which existentialism keeps reminding us repeatedly, that the most important questions of life are not accessible or cannot be answered with the help of reason or science. They have to be tackled differently. For example, what is the meaning of life? Science can help you. For example, a person has a disease, science can help him. Science can prescribe you the accurate treatment you have to take for getting relief from this particular disease. But the moment a person starts asking questions like what is the meaning of life, he enters the domain of philosophy, and reason cannot probably answer this question completely and satisfactorily. You need to employ certain other ways, other methodologies to capture the real sense of life. Again, existentialism reminds us that death is the only certainty. See, one aspect which existential philosophers, most of them, emphasize is that the facticity of human existence. We are limited, we exist in space and time in a particular context, historical, political, social and cultural context, which are not our creations. So, what we are to some extent are decided by the world, but at the same time we have the freedom to change it, to change ourselves. So, there is a dilemma, there is a tension, there are confusions, all these are part of human existence. So, death is the only certainty. As far as we are concerned, what is going to happen in the next moment or the next day, what we are going to do, we cannot predict now, but there is one thing which is predictable, that we all will die one day. So, death is the only certainty as far as humans are concerned. Now, let us see some of the common features of existential philosophy, or most of the philosophers of existential style of philosophizing have subscribed to many of these assumptions. They are all against systematization of reality, particularly human reality. Here there is a very direct reference to people like Hegel, Marx even. They were all trying to systematize human reality, trying to explain the whole of human reality with the help of a rational system. So, existentialists would disagree with this. They would say that it is impossible, we cannot explain human reality with the help of such rational systems. Again, against all forms of essentialism, the immediate antithesis of existentialism is Hegelian philosophy, because Hegelian philosophy epitomizes the human essence, or rather it says that there is something called the absolute reason, which is an all encompassing reality and which would rather encompasses everything, all thought process, even contradictions are part of this universal mind, this absolute. Against metaphysics, that is purely speculative. See, one thing is important, that existentialism, though it is explicitly against metaphysics, it is not completely anti-metaphysical, because some of the existential philosophers also employ metaphysics, but it is against metaphysics which is purely speculative, the kind of metaphysics which traditional Western philosophers like Hegel and Plato and all these people employ. And the emphasis on individuality is the characteristic feature, we can say, of existentialism, and the narration of human struggle to achieve self definition through choice. This is a very important idea, or rather a theme in existential philosophy, the notion of self definition through choices. We will find this concept in Nietzsche very vigorously. Nietzsche asserts this concept, the concept of self creation, in a very emphatic manner, and here we will find in the philosophies of most of these existential thinkers like Heidegger and Sartre particularly, they both emphasize the importance of self creation. For Heidegger, it is called authentic existence. And now let us see the key themes of existential philosophy. Freedom is one very important theme in existentialism. We will be explaining all these things elaborately in the coming episodes. So, I will be just very briefly mentioning about them here. This is particularly in the philosophy of Sartre. He would say that we are condemned to be free, man is condemned to be free. I will explain this in the coming episodes. And responsibility, the concept of responsibility becomes important, because since we are free, we cannot blame anybody else for what is happening in our life. We have the basic freedom of choice we can make any choices. So, whatever the consequences we are going to have are the result of the choices which we made, and we cannot blame others for that. So, the responsibility is ours, because we have freedom in our fundamental projects and attitudes, we are responsible for the people we become. Emphasizing individuality, his or her search for authentic selfhood is a major issue. Ideas of self creation and authentic existence becomes important in this context. Again, anxiety dread, anguish, and all these are, when we reflect on our freedom, we experience anxiety. So, we could see that these are quite uncharacteristic of Western philosophy to deal with notions like this: dread, for example, anxiety, for example. These are all concepts which you do not find in the scheme of things of philosophers, traditional philosophers, but they are problems of individual human beings. So, the existential philosophers take them up and discuss. Bad faith: those who refuse to take responsibility for themselves are living an inauthentic existence in bad faith, they are self-deluded. So, this is particularly developed by Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre particularly introduces the word bad faith. Finitude, guilt, alienation, despair, death, all these are other key concepts, not topics of discussion in traditional philosophy, but these philosophers take up these issues and discuss them elaborately. Rather, problems like alienation is very important for almost all existential thinkers. Again, acknowledgement of the tragic element of human existence. See, we can see that some of the existential thinkers are even pessimist. Say for example, people like Albert Camus, who would rather assert the essential absurdity of human life. There is a whole movement called absurdism. They believe that human life is basically absurd. So, Camus' very famous celebrated statement in his Myth of Sisyphus is that the most important philosophical problem of 20th century is that of murder and suicide, because life is basically absurd. So, but at the same time there are philosophers in the existential tradition who are optimist, but still there is an acknowledgement of the tragic element of human existence, and then all of them acknowledge the reality of death, or they have some thoughts about what death is, or they try to place death as a very important concept in the scheme of philosophical things. Then again finitude, which we have already examined. We will now wind up this episode, but before that let us have a very brief mention about the origins of existentialism. It actually, the basic themes of existentialism we will find in the Christian tradition itself. We will elaborate upon this in the coming episodes. Now, before we wind up, let us look at the topics which we have discussed today. Let us have a summary of the topics which we have discussed in this present episode. Yeah, we have seen what is existentialism in this episode. Basically, we have introduced what existentialism is, or the philosophy of existentialism in this episode. We were trying to prepare the background in which we can carry out these discussions further. So, what existentialism is, what are some of its important themes, common features and key ideas. So, basically we have discussed all these issues in this episode. Now, let us consider a couple of questions from this episode. Number one, in what way does existentialism differ from traditional philosophy? And number two, write briefly the concept of man in existentialism. With this, we will wind up this episode. Thank you.